The opinions expressed on this program are those of the program hosts and their guests and are not necessarily those of WSTU, St. Mary's Episcopal Church, and Temple Beit Hayim. Products that may be mentioned are not necessarily intended as an endorsement. Any reproduction or retransmission of this broadcast is strictly prohibited. And now, WSTU presents a priest and a rabbi. Call in with questions and comments at 220-9788. 220-WSTU. Now, here's your host.
Good morning, everybody. This is Father Christian over at St. Mary's Episcopal Church with my favorite rabbi, the best-looking rabbi this side of the Jordan River. It is Rabbi Matthew Durbin from Temple Beit Hayim right here in Stuart, Florida. And we are a priest and a rabbi just joining you in your cars as you drive to work. And what better way to do that but to have two bright, shining clergy members saying, good morning. How are you?
My favorite is Father Anderson, that it has taken almost 2 years now of this show, and you have nailed the Hebrew. We are Beit Hayim. I love it.
Beit Hayim. Yes, I'm there. And even later, so in a little bit, we're going to have another rabbi on today. And I learned something today that he is not from a temple, he's from a synagogue, because there's a difference between the conservative and the reform. And so you are at Temple Beit Hayim.
I'm just glad you said reform as opposed to reformed.
Yeah, that was a mistake early on the show. If you guys have been listening to the show, in my idiocy, I would refer to rabbi's denomination as reformed, but it's reform, which actually comes up much better now when we tag it on social media that actually reform comes up. Reform Judaism does not come up. I don't know why. I mean, that's just whatever. So it's good to have you here, brother. I know you're a little bit under the weather, but you made it, and but you're looking good. You're looking strong. How are you? How's your wife? How are your kids?
It's been really good. My youngest just celebrated her birthday on Monday.
I saw that on Facebook.
So we decided to take our kids with my in-laws out to Epcot last Sunday. And just, it's a funny story. So the few times that we've been to Epcot in the past, the second we get there is like a mad rush, because we get these like fast passes. We wanted to go to Elsa and Anna's little like thing that they do. So we get there, and immediately my wife is like, we gotta go. So we like rush into this thing, and my kids are freaked out a little bit. They're running. Epcot is not small, it's huge. And by the time they get there, they're exhausted. So we do this whole Epcot thing, and we celebrate her birthday. She turned 4 on Monday. And it was just it was a great time. And driving in the car this morning, I said to her, I said, so, Delilah, what's it like? What does it feel like being 4? And then I see the head go down. She goes, I just want to be 3 again. Oh, and I find it almost 42. I say to myself, I just want to be 40 again.
Yeah. That was, so it's already this life is weighing on her. It's a big jump from 3 to 4, man. Your responsibilities start clicking in. You got to start worrying about college tuition.
It's tough.
It's tough out there for a girl. So, all right. So today, we for the show, it is February, so it is Black History Month. And in the past, last year, we brought on some great civic leaders to be talking about this and discussing it from a faith perspective, most importantly, right? So we hear a lot about Black History Month, in the schools and in other mediums, but it is important for us as people of faith, from houses of worship, of the deep reflection that we can have during Black History Month. We hear a lot about Black leaders that we get maybe on TV or all the various mediums. But I think this time is also a time for a deep reflection of where are we in the midst of awareness of Black history, and especially I think as you and I are here, two white guys sitting in a studio booth, of our reflection on our as we talk about Black history, but we're really also let's talk about structural racism that we still have, and how structural racism has poked its head in religion, how we've seen it in our houses of worship. and how at times throughout just in our country that our respective religions have been complicit. I mean, there's been times when, yes, our leaders have been on the front lines from the Episcopal denomination, from Reform Judaism, been on the front lines fighting for civil rights, but there have been times when it's definitely been complicit in shaking hands with secular society and enforcing segregation and actually standing against integration. And so we need to do an awareness of this. So on today's show, we want to explore this idea of exploring a history of racism in your own denomination, in houses of faith. How do you now in the 21st century begin to have that conversation, that talk about it? And so what Rabbi and I are doing is we're going to bring on two guests today, not one, not one, but two, because it's a weightier topic. And so we're bringing out two more white guys to talk about this. We're just going to try to own this before, so right at the top of the show. But there's a reason why we're going to be bringing on Father Gray Maggiano, who's an Episcopal priest out in Baltimore at Memorial Episcopal Church. And then also Rabbi Daniel Berg over at Bethlehem Synagogue, both in Baltimore. So gentlemen, welcome to the show. Thank you for calling in all the way from sunny and warm Baltimore.
Thanks so much, and I wish it was sunny and warm here. It's about 50 degrees and pouring rain.
We had a little bit of rain last night, but yeah, I think it's like 70 outside.
It's 62. It's freezing.
Oh gosh. All right, so gentlemen, Gray, you have been on this show before, and it was great having you on the show, and so you were so good. Your fans have said, get this guy back on the show, please. And so, but Father Gray, let's first start with you. Your church, Memorial Episcopal Church, has been going through quite the journey and reflection over the last year, maybe even longer. Can you just give us a little understanding of what you all have been doing about understanding the history of racism at your church?
Sure. So Memorial Episcopal Church is a historic church in Baltimore. We were founded in 1860, and everybody in Baltimore is very aware that the city is hyper segregated. That we have some neighborhoods that are almost entirely white, and many neighborhoods that are almost entirely black, and that the reality of segregation that began a long time ago continues to persist today. And the question that became raised in our church is why is our church so segregated? I mean, Memorial Episcopal Church is again a historic Episcopal church. The neighborhood that we're in is somewhere around 40% African American. The city of Baltimore is between 60 and 70% African American, yet the church is 95% white. And we're sort of interrogating why this is. And we began to do some history of the church, and the first thing we discovered is that the founding, when churches were founded, is important because that often says a lot about where they are. And being founded on the eve of the Civil War tells a lot about a place. And so we discovered that we were founded in 1860, and that both founders of the church were big supporters of the Confederacy and the institution of slavery. They both actually had enslaved people themselves. And we then discovered that of the first 8 rectors of the church, 7 served in the Confederacy. So there was a long history, legacy of Confederate support and support for the institution of slavery that continued well into the 20th century because the leadership continued to reflect that ethos. And then as we dug into the history of segregation in Baltimore, and this is with a lot of help from a book called Not in My Neighborhood, written by a former Baltimore Sun reporter who wrote about the history of segregation in Baltimore. But a lot of that began here in this community, a neighborhood now called Bolton Hill. It was then the Mount Royal district. And there was a strong effort to keep the neighborhood white. And that began in the parish hall of this church. It was members of the church and the community who set up the Mount Royal Protective Association. They assigned block captains to each block. They were the block captains were supposed to watch out for black families trying to buy or rent homes in the community and report those up and find ways to keep them out. And there were a number of pieces of local and state legislation that was put forward by lawyers involved in this, some of whom were actually chancellors to the Episcopal Diocese here, which means sort of the lawyer for the whole Diocese of Maryland, who to keep neighborhoods segregated. One particularly egregious example in the 1920s, a black pastor who was pastoring a church nearby at Enon Baptist Church had attempted to buy a house 2 blocks down from our church. And he purchased the house, and the only way to do that was to allow the former owner, who was white, to live in the 3rd floor. So he rented the 3rd floor to the former owner, and he lived on the first 2 floors. Because written into the deed of all the houses at that time was that the houses could not be occupied by a black person. So he purchases the house. He leaves to go on vacation, and when he comes back, all of his possessions are on the front lawn, and he's been evicted from the home because the neighbors conspired to not file the taxes due on the purchase of the home, because the tax assessor also lived in the community and helped with this. And so this was eventually overturned in court, but it was a very significant court case in the 1920s, and this really sort of egregious effort to keep a fellow man of God from owning a home in the community. So we began to do all this history and storytelling and understanding, why there might be some reticence among Black Baltimore to trust people from Bolton Hill and to trust the church in Bolton Hill. And then the bishop appointed us a new deacon, the Reverend Natalie Conway, in I guess a year and a half ago now. And Natalie grew up in Baltimore. She's an African American. She's been ordained, I think, about 10 years now as deacon. And her family was doing some family genealogy and discovered that her family had been enslaved at a local plantation here called the Hampton Plantation, which was run by the Ridgely Howard family. And so she discovered this as about the same time she discovered that the church that she was serving at Memorial here was founded by the Reverend Charles Ridgely Howard, who was born at Hampton Plantation, whose parents had enslaved more than 400 people at the plantation, and that her story suddenly was very interconnected to our story. And that really, I think, pushed things internally in the church to a new level because it suddenly became personal. This story that seemed kind of like distant and esoteric was right in front of us. I mean, it was Natalie's great-grandmother who was enslaved at Hampton Plantation, someone she has pictures of, someone she's heard stories of, someone that is a part of her family story. And we also have in our parish a descendant of the Howard family, not a direct descendant of Charles Ridgely Howard because he didn't have any children, but of the broader Howard family, including those who enslaved folks at Hampton Plantation. And so it really became a call to us to really do some, introspection and figure out, how do we respond to this? What is our response, both to Natalie and to her family, but to the broader Black community here in Baltimore.
If you're just tuning in, this is a priest and a rabbi here at WSTU, and the phone number here is 220-9788. That's 772. But we're on the phone with Father Gray Maggiano, and Father Gray. So this process that you went on to start this introspection and to interrogate the history, how long has that been going on for? Is this journey?
We've been, I think, about 2 years, but it really got pushed into a higher gear, a different level, when Natalie came to be a part of our congregation, and when she made this personal discovery, and that happened in the summer of 2019, so about 6 months ago. And yeah, I think what it taught me was that Natalie was very nervous at first about sharing her story because she wasn't sure how the church was going to respond. And to be honest, if we had not done all this preemptive work to set a place where that conversation could be raised, the church probably would not have responded very well. They would have said, that's ancient history, that's not who we are, let's not talk about this. But because we had done all this preemptive work about our story, it created some fertile soil for her story to take root and really be understood.
So there was a key there. There was a moment there where you did have buy-in from the whole congregation to say, oh, we are in a 40 to 6% Black neighborhood, but yet we're an all-white church. What's going on here? Let's start to take a journey together and learn more about this. I mean, it sounded like from the beginning you had that buy-in.
Yes.
And the reason for that buy-in was just curiosity of what's going on here. What?
I don't think it was just that, and Rabbi Berg can speak more to this, but coming to Baltimore, I came here in 2016, a year after the Freddie Gray uprising. Freddie Gray was a young Black man who was killed by police here in Baltimore, and it really brought the whole city to account to discuss the issue of police brutality and the larger issue of inequality in the city and segregation and racism here in the city. And so the whole city at that point was wrestling with this question. To some extent, I don't think if we didn't have that as a base, no one would have wanted to have the conversation, any conversation around this. There would have been other more important things to talk about, poverty in Africa or clean water in South America or something else. But because everybody in the city at the same time was wrestling with this question, and Rabbi Berg, who was here during that time, can speak more about what that period was like. But that really, there was a collective conversation going on across the city.
That's great. So let's bring on Rabbi Berg to come on here. So Rabbi Berg, so you are obviously a colleague of Reverend Maggiano, and you help lead a synagogue that's right in Baltimore. And so tell us what the journey that you all have been taking as being in Baltimore, a place that's been a hotbed for racial divisiveness, for racism. And so what's the story of you and your congregation?
Sure. Well, first of all, it's great to be on, and really glad to be here with Reverend Gray, who has been a good friend and colleague. Just to give you a sense of the geography, our congregations are probably about 1.5 miles apart from one another. And so the neighborhood that Gray is describing in Bolton Hill, as the crow flies, is really quite close. There are our neighbors to the south, but has some very stark differences with the neighborhood where I live, which is Reservoir Hill. I'll also say that both he and I live in our respective neighborhoods, which is for us, and I know for him, was a values choice to live where we work and live where we teach and preach and try to be a part of the communities that we want to serve. Reservoir Hill, our neighborhood, was and is a majority Black neighborhood and has been so for many decades now. But in the early 20th century, it was the heart of the Jewish community of Baltimore. And Jewish migratory patterns in Baltimore really had the community moving in the mid-19th century. We're in East Baltimore, and then kind of hopped over to central West Baltimore, and then kind of up a street called Utah Place, and then just kept going. So if you ever see the movie Liberty Heights or Liberty Road is really just kind of around the corner from us, right by Mondawmin Mall, which is where the 2015 rioting began, the rioting being one small piece of the overall uprising in Baltimore in the aftermath of Freddie Gray's death. So Freddie Gray was arrested about 1 mile from where both of us live, and what you saw on the news, which was happening between police and young people, that was about 1 mile from me, northwest. In terms of our own congregation, we are a 98-year-old building, but a 45-year-old congregation. The synagogue that built our building in 1922 moved out to the county, and for a number of years they maintained 2 campuses, an in-town and a suburban campus. And in 1974, they were ready to sell the building. There was every reason to believe it would become a church, like most historic synagogue buildings in Baltimore were, as the Jewish community moved or fled, depending how you think about this. And a group of congregants who were affiliated with that congregation, or who lived in the city, or who were involved in city leadership, or maybe even some who lived in the county but were more urban oriented and didn't want to leave this historic building, decided to purchase the building from that congregation and to create Beth Am Synagogue. So we've been a synagogue for almost 100 years, but we've been two different congregations, two different synagogues there. In terms of our own work in the community, I like to think about what we do as bearing witness to the nexus of history and geography that is our neighborhood. And so how do we authentically embody a Jewish community and all of the beauty that comes along with being a Jewish community in a historically Jewish neighborhood? And then how do we also not just kind of hunker down and act as if we're kind of a UFO planted in a neighborhood which is mostly not Jewish? Most of my congregants live in other neighborhoods. Some do live in our neighborhood, and a number of young families have moved back to Reservoir Hill. But how do we actually serve as an effective community anchor in our neighborhood? How do we soften boundaries of race and class? How do we go out into our community and encourage more members of my synagogue to get to know their neighbors? And so that journey began before I got to Baltimore. I came in 2010, but the work we've been doing since I came has been less focused on service, or at least less exclusively focused on service and volunteerism, which has happened for many years, volunteering at the school and greening projects in the neighborhood and helping to rehab some homes, and doing maybe occasional health fairs to mobilize whatever resources we have in the congregation to help neighbors in the community. But how do we move to more relational justice work? And the way that we frame this is based on a sermon I gave years ago that I never intended to be the title of anything. But I talked about how in 1974, we were in our neighborhood when others were leaving the city, particularly other white institutions were leaving the city, white people were leaving the city. And soon we realized that we needed to not be just in the neighborhood, but for the neighborhood, which is when the volunteerism really started, and our connections with other institutions, doing drives and things like that. But that the next real vanguard is, how are we of our neighborhood? How are we both in, for, but also of our neighborhood? How do we think of our neighborhood as our neighborhood, even if we don't live there, but we worship there, or we study there, or we volunteer there? And so what we've tried to do is place this IFO lens on the work that we do, whether it's social action work or whether it's education. We actually created a nonprofit in 2013, a separate nonprofit, its own 501c3 that's affiliated with Beth Am Synagogue called IFO. We have a board of trustees. Some are African-American residents of our neighborhood who are not Jewish. Some are Jewish members of our congregation who have white skin privilege. Some live in the neighborhoods and some don't live in the neighborhood. A couple are Jews of color who live in the community. And so what we're trying to do is to work collaboratively with our neighbors to try to dismantle some of the racist and anti-Semitic tendencies that have been present in this country, but certainly have been very much present in Baltimore.
Rabbi, this is great. Thank you so much. I have a question for you. Is that there is at times in our country, and depending on where you're at and which neighborhood you're in, there has been a historic tension at times between African American and Jewish neighborhoods. So I'm thinking in Los Angeles, I know there's been some tension, and so I don't know if that is also prevalent in Baltimore, and if it is, have you all have been able to address that or take that on in your relational justice or just building relationships and collaboration within the community?
It's a great question. Certainly that tension exists in Baltimore. Happily, it exists less in our community, or I would say it exists differently in our community because we actually lean into the tension. We're interested in having that productive discomfort. So we have like our IFO organization now is sponsoring a book group where a bunch of members of the synagogue are reading Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility, and then talking about sort of our own tendencies toward racism and how do we understand that and how do we move through it. So we're really always looking for ways to grow and inviting our neighbors to sort of learn about us and get to know us as people and as our. So I think that because we're in relationship and because we, for example, like this for Black History Month, tomorrow we're going to be hosting a choir from a Black Baptist church that's going to be performing, and there's a bar mitzvah this week. So you might think in some situations, if you wanted to do something like that, you say to a bar mitzvah family, well, we are interested in doing this thing. They'll say, yeah, but really not on like my bar mitzvah. We want the rabbi to give a sermon. We want it to be more of a traditional thing. Do that stuff like another time. But Beth Am is a place where much more often than not, and I knew this would be the case with this family, the reaction would be, oh my God, that sounds amazing. What a great way to celebrate my bar mitzvah is to have 20 minutes of African spirituals and music that celebrates the African diaspora. And so our congregants, I think, have a better sensitivity. That doesn't happen by accident. Some of it is self-selecting. They've come to our congregation, but some of it is they've been part of the work that we've been doing over several years. And so they feel like showing up for something like this is exactly the sort of Judaism that they want to be a part of. But there are other places in Baltimore where there's great tension and where I would say the collaborative work is sometimes a little more public relational than it is relational. And that's sad. Some in Baltimore have looked to us in our neighborhood as a model for how Jewish communities and African-American communities can work together. And I do want to just note one last thing, which is a lot of times the binary of Jewish and African-American is something we fall into because we have those stories of like Dr. King and Rabbi Heschel marching hand in hand during the civil rights era. And those alliances are powerful, but it's important to remember that 10 to 15% of Jews are Jews of color, and they have to locate themselves in that narrative. So the more that we talk about Jewish communities not as sort of being mutually exclusive to communities of color, the better we're going to do, both at owning the ways that many of us, most of us, do have white privilege in the Jewish community, but also the ways that we are not monolithic racially or ethnically.
And Rabbi Berg, to talk about, the congregation in terms of their openness and ability, did you, through the work that you have done and certainly the community has done in its early stages, was there any pushback? Was there 100% buy-in?
Are you talking to me? I'm having some trouble hearing you.
Oh, you hear me now?
Barely.
No.
My apologies.
Okay, so the rabbi, what Rabbi Berg, what Rabbi Durbin is saying is that he is wondering if, when you began this work in your congregation, was there any pushback that you were feeling once this started? Was there any tension or any kind of dialogue or conversation that needed to happen in order for this to or to begin this this process?
Oh, for sure. And, we're a congregation of 460 households, and they're not monolithic in their perspectives. There are people who are members of the synagogue because they like the food at the Kiddush lunch on Saturdays, not because they want to do social justice or racial justice work. So the goal is not to be, a congregation of, automatons or Stepford wives. People have their views. What we're trying to do is lean into an ethos. And, I'll give you my congregants, for the most part, I would say that they affiliate with their congregation because they like the idea that we're in a Black neighborhood, because they like the idea that we're in a historic synagogue, because they like the idea that we do social justice work. But the sort of level of knowledge and sophistication around questions of structural racism, institutional racism that exists within the Jewish community, there's a really wide variety. And I got some great advice from Rabbi Susan Talvey, who is at a congregation in St. Louis, who was very involved in the Black Lives Matter movement during its inception after Mike Brown was killed. And when the Baltimore uprising happened, Rabbi Talby happened to be on the East Coast, and we got a call saying, Rabbi Talby is around. Would you be interested in her coming to talk to you about what they've learned from Ferguson? And we said, of course, that would be wonderful. So Susan came down to Baltimore, and we all sat on my back porch and invited a bunch of rabbinic colleagues. And she talked to us about what they'd learned and the mistakes they had made and the tensions that still exist and how to kind of move through them. And the best advice she had was what do you do when people are resistant to these things? And she said, you got to love them through it. I'm in this business because I love the Jewish people and I love God. And I also love humanity, even when they're being terrifyingly destructive. And so sorry, my apologies. So, that advice of saying we don't have to all be comfortable. The goal here is not comfortable. The goal is we have to live lives of purpose. And if I can get more of my congregants to do that with regard to these questions and issues, great. And if I can do it by helping to be present with them in their moments of loss, or in their moments of joy, also great. We're not a one-trick pony.
I think this is what you said, is that loving people through this process, no matter what comes up, and the tensions and the pushback that you get is key, right? Over here in Stewart, we are in a post-segregationalist area. I've had a congregant come in just recently, wanted to say, what is the history? I mean, there's such a deep history here in just Stewart, Florida, of the effects of segregation. And when you go to the museums that we have here, they don't talk about the Black history, and they don't even recognize what the effects of just the segregationist past. That there's institutions that we have here in town that once upon a time were completely segregated. That high schools, that was the Black high schools, the white high school, and it's not talked about. And when it's not talked about, it's just completely swept under. But what it doesn't allow us, though, as especially just from people of faith, to be able to discern and to talk about, okay, what we might be different people we are today. However, what happened during the 30s, 40s, and 50s and 60s here in Stewart has definitely affected the structures that we're a part of. And these structures are still facilitating racism and exclusivism. And we look at the Black neighborhood here in Stewart. It's not made on a grid, so that grid cannot permeate into the other part of the town. It was purposely made so it would be separate. And so there's all these still lasting impact of really how it's created dividing lines in our community, but we're not talking about it. And so when we want to start, and I was really inspired by Father Gray, who gave a workshop at a big conference that we were at called Rooted in Jesus, about the process that their congregation is taking. And I think that there's some hunger in our church to start taking that journey. However, the voices that are coming forward are the voices that you expect to say, hey, we want to have this conversation. We need to learn more. There's something that's being swept under the rug here. However, I'm curious, when and we haven't done the research that Father Gray has done, which is now, where was our church? Where was St. Mary's complicit in this? We haven't looked through decisions and choices and opinions that were made during the 30s, 40s, and 50s and 60s from our church. And so we want to take that journey. However, there's a process here that you have to, I guess, respect, because you don't want to lose anyone, and you don't want to jump right into it head first, I'm assuming. And maybe Father Gray, you can speak to this. I think, Father Gray, you said first you start with let's just talk about our church and the history of the church, and then say, and also let's talk about the whole history. And we got some parts of here which are not pretty, as opposed to saying, hey, everyone, there's some parts of our church that are not pretty. Let's talk about this right now. You might lose people, and then now the conversation has gone nowhere. I mean, Father Gray, am I aligning with what you mentioned in the past here?
No, yeah. I mean, I think the thing that's important to remember, I think a good place to start is, why do we do this work? And Rabbi Berg put it well that, for them it's about being in relationship and improving relationship with the community around them, and living into their Jewish values. And so for us as people of faith, I think one of the reasons that the churches need to do this work is not necessarily to sort of whip ourselves for all the terrible things we've done in the past, but to be able to say, to to remind ourselves that in 100 years, in 50 years, people are going to look back on us and say all the terrible things that we did. So we do this work in part to help be better citizens today, not just to make some statement atonement for the past and create a better world today that we can live into. And so which requires a little bit of grace and the need to look at the past and say, yes, here are all these terrible things that these people did, and yet they were also our brothers, our sisters, our parents, our grandparents. They were priests and people who were beloved in God's church. They were faithful congregants, whether they were in a Jewish synagogue or a Christian church, and they also made some bad choices. And being able to hold that tension together is important. And I think and also looking for relationship as part of the as part of the work. One of the things I think the big failings that you see when sort of the secular world tries to do this, and not to be critical of any particular organization, but often when things are done entirely in a vacuum, we forget about the reason. And if you put a bunch of well-meaning white people together and say, well, let's talk about racism without any context for what the purpose is or why they're doing it, you end up just creating a vehicle to out woke each other as to who can be the most aggressively anti-racist without actually doing anything to make the current world we live in a better, more livable place. So a lot of the work that we've tried to do here is in that relational vein of being, there's an Episcopal church 6 blocks away that's a historically Black Episcopal church because they couldn't join our church. So how can we improve relationships there? Our neighborhood association started a group called the Social Action Task Force that has begun to partner with organizations and community organizations across Utah Place, which is the historic dividing line between white Baltimore and Black Baltimore, to develop better relationships and to create partnerships, and using that as a way to kind of to give purpose for why we're doing this beyond just kind of feeling better about ourselves.
Right. This is good. So, gentlemen, I'm going to take a quick break here, and when we come back, is get your insights on if any church or synagogue is out there right now that is looking to take this journey. Just what your words of advice are going to be of things to think about and discern and what to pray about. And a little bit about where's God in the midst of all this? Why do we do all this? And what inspires you both in the work that you do from a theological standpoint, from a spiritual standpoint? Where do you feel the Spirit is moving you both? So we'll be right back here on A Priest and a Rabbi with Reverend Gray and with Rabbi Dan. And welcome back to the second part of A Priest and a Rabbi here, where we are on the phone with Reverend Dan and Reverend Gray out of Baltimore, both who are, well, actually we say Rabbi Dan, but he's Reverend. He's revered. And both of our colleagues here, we are during this time of Black History Month, we are discussing and wanting to go below the surface here of discussing from in our houses of worship, how we are approaching racism and racial tension in our neighborhoods in the context that we exist in. What is our responsibility as clerics to address the obvious issues of either historical racism, and we know historical racism then has effect on our present day racism. We can't just say, oh, we're all good now, right? We were all past the civil rights. Everything's good and peachy now. But
I think also, it's also about how do we start the conversation, right? We know that this exists. We know that there are challenges that have existed throughout our historical past. And how do we, as members of faith, clergy members within our respective communities, how do we engage our communities to open up the conversation and to move past just the conversation towards trying to make some semblance of peace, harmony, whatever it may be, to explore the issue and to really tackle something that is very very challenging, very difficult in our midst, to be able to inform and educate others on the process that has happened.
And I'm assuming there's a very, well, we know that there's a spiritual discernment that has to come along with this. So if anyone is, I'm sure you can always contact Reverend Gray to hear more about, he teaches workshops on this, of how he's approached this, or speaks at conferences about this, of how Memorial Episcopal Church has taken this approach. But there's and we also want to call out today, as we said this at the top of the show, that we do realize the irony here, that we're just four white guys sitting here talking about this. And in the, with the Priest and Rabbi show throughout this month, we are going to be bringing on various leaders, African-American leaders, white leaders, just let's have the dialogue and the discussion. But there is I think there's a responsibility we have as clerics to take this head on. I like to refer to James Cone, a Black liberation theologian, who says, if the church, and you can put synagogue, temple right in there, if the church is to remain faithful to its Lord, it must make a decisive break with the structure of this society by launching a vehement attack on the evils of racism in all forms. It must become prophetic, demanding a radical change in the interlocking structures of this society. And there's, for me, there's a relational aspect. We build these relationships, but and we can talk about it. And I think what Reverend Gray was talking about, that you can, outwoke one another. But then there's a part of now we got to look at the structures that are in place. And I just want to hear from both of you gentlemen that great work that you're doing within your communities. What is the theological fire or the spiritual fire that's behind you when you're praying to God, when you're forming your sermons? Where are you finding God in the midst of this, or the urge, the catalyst to do this from how God is moving you? How has that relationship been, or that journey been from a spiritual standpoint?
Yeah, well, I would say, first of all, Father Gray and I try not to outwoke each other, but he might be able to outwoke me. He was able to out-pedal me. We actually got to travel by bicycle from Jerusalem down to Eilat together fairly recently. An amazing bike ride of almost 300 miles. And Reverend Gray was definitely taking those hills faster than I was. So it's been a delight to get to know him both locally and to do some traveling together. For our part, I think that, first of all, I actually think it's a great thing that it's four white guys talking about this. And I agree that obviously we want to hear voices from African Americans speaking for themselves. But part of the problem that we have in this country is that too many white people don't take the opportunity to talk to other white folks about our racism and about our implicit biases. And I think one of the things we're learning is that the more we do take those opportunities to have those conversations, the more that we as people of privilege, right, white, straight men, for example, will actually kind of move through our own problematic behavior in the world. And the world has been greatly damaged by the power that straight white men have wielded in many instances. They also do some good things, but so I think having this conversation is great. From the Jewish perspective, I mean, I think I could regale you with lots of stories, as I'm sure Rabbi Durbin could as well. Two stories that I use to kind of frame our thinking is one, a story about Abraham that comes from the Midrash, the interpretive tradition of the written Torah, in which, like, the question is asked, why did Abraham come to his monotheism? Why did he believe in God in the first place and be able to answer, yes, I'll go to this new land when this God that he'd never met before called out to him? And the Midrash explains that he was like a person walking around and noticed a palace on fire. And when he saw that the palace was on fire, his immediate instinct was, well, maybe nobody's in charge of this place. Maybe nobody's putting out that fire. Maybe there's just nobody home. And at that moment, the master of the palace peeks out from the curtains and says, no, I'm here. I'm in charge of this place. And the rabbis talk about this as an analog for the world, that we notice the world's on fire. Abraham noticed that the world was on fire. And his immediate reaction was actually not monotheism, it was atheism. It was, wow, maybe nobody's in charge here, and kind of goads God out of hiding, who then has to say, wait a second, I'm in charge, but I didn't start this fire. Like, I didn't light the palace on fire. You all did that. I gave you free will, and now you have to put it out. I'm going to be here with you, but I'm not going to fix it for you. So that's one thing that I think about a lot. And the second story that I think about a lot is a story that comes from the Talmud of a particular farmer who is clearing fieldstones from his property. And he's taking the fieldstones and he's chucking them out into the street so that he can better plant his crops. And along comes an old man and sees him doing this. And he says, sir, what are you doing throwing stones from property which is not yours into property that is yours? And the farmer thinks about this for a second and says, wow, this guy's nuts. What is he talking about? I'm not throwing stones from property that's not mine. This is my property. This is my land. And that's just the street. That doesn't belong to me. And so he dismisses the guy out of hand. But several years later, he learns the lesson of what this older man was talking about when he falls on hard times financially and he loses his farm. And one day he's walking along the street and he trips on one of the stones that he had thrown there. And I think a lot about space and shared space in our community. What does it mean to actually claim the public square as our land? And what does it mean to cede responsibility for what we think is our personal space to some broader collective? And how does that help us understand the way that we came about possessions of things? You know, it is absolutely true that because of federal housing authority policies and redlining, people who look like me were able to purchase homes in neighborhoods that people of color were not. And being aware of that, being aware of the privilege that comes with ownership and what it means for others who may not have the same access to what people of privilege have, is, I think, how we begin to move through some of these destructive tendencies of structural and institutional racism in America.
That's well put. Really well put. Jens, this is great. And we're nearing the end of the show here, and so we have a couple minutes left, but I want to, Reverend Gray, if you could give just a little bit of insight too about where do you find God in the midst of this, or how God is moving through you, or you feel God moving through your congregation and doing this valuable work?
You know, I think I always lament when I talk to Daniel, because they have this rich, 1,000-year tradition in the Mishnah and the Talmud of storytelling, and we, in our Christian tradition, don't have quite the same depth. So often, when I don't have something for a sermon, we'll call Daniel up, or we'll meet together, and then I'll blatantly steal something from that tradition to make my sermon better. So I'll have to keep those in my head. So thanks, Daniel. But I think the place that I see God in this is reflecting on Jesus' encounters with the Samaritans throughout his ministry, and the way he talks about Samaritans. And it's and there's a lot of danger here in those conversations. Has historically raised a lot of anti-Semitism and division between the Christian community and the Jewish community. But if we spend some time with those stories, what we find Jesus saying, I think, is that none of us are free till all of us are free, and that we always, God is always bigger than the world that we imagine, the world that we live in, and we can't just community without acknowledging some of the stuff going on in the community around it. And so, seeing that play out in real life gives me life. The relationship we've been able to develop with St. Catherine's Episcopal Church, which is a historically Black Episcopal church a few miles away, or a few blocks away. I mean, less than half a mile away from our church. What was surprising, I think, to my congregation, it was surprising first that they didn't know a church was there at all. There was an Episcopal church so close. And then it was even more surprising to them that they didn't know we were here. And this is often how whiteness works in the world, that we just assume everyone knows about us because we're great and wonderful. But the reality is they had no more interest in us than we had in them. And now,
Reverend Gray, I just want to keep you in mind that we just got, I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but we got about 40 seconds left on the show. And so to jump in, and I to apologize for that. But listen, there's a lot of fodder here to continue to uncover here. And if anyone, you're listening, you want to learn more about this, to find Rabbi Berg over at Bethlehem Synagogue, and then Father Gray Maggiano over at Memorial Episcopal Church in Baltimore. And you go on their website and check out the great work that they are doing out there. Gentlemen, thank you so much for being on the show today. It was really just awesome. I wish we had more time to get into this, and I'm sorry, we're restricted by time. If you're just tuning in, you can check out the podcast, A Priest and a Rabbi. Google it and hear the rest of it. God bless you, gentlemen, and hope to see you again soon.